this video, I'm going to be adding some texture to the base of this Necromunda Quad that I've just built. What I want to do is create tyre tracks in this base, just to give it a little bit more detail before I add any other kind of basing to it when I start the painting process. I quite like the idea of having vehicles on bases. Allows you to play around a little bit with how they look and so on. So without the base, they're still really nice, but I want to use the bases on these ones. So what I want to do is put a material down onto this. In this case, I'm going to use green stuff, but you could use air drying clay, milliput, anything that dries, but you can sculpt a little bit with it. But I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to use green stuff, and I'm going to put that down onto the base. I'm then, because I've already stuck these tyres in place, I'm going to use tyres from the second quad that I haven't yet built to put the texture into the base. So to start with, I've got green stuff, and I've got pre-mixed green stuff. I'm going to put this onto the base. Sometimes as well you'll find a few little bits of kind of the crust that hasn't quite mixed. I don't really worry about these. I'll leave them in once I've painted over the top of them. They're not really going to be noticed. So I'm not worried about the fingerprints in this as well, because as I said, I'm going to be painting this base and adding some texture and so on. So I've got the base roughly on there. What I'm going to do now is position the quad on the base, and I'm gently just going to push it down into place. The reason why I'm doing this is so I can make sure the tyre tracks line up with the tread on the wheels. It's not a necessity, you don't have to do this. Because I've already stuck the wheels on, I want to be able to line it all up. So a little bit of green stuff on the base of the tyres, but that doesn't matter. So I've got those points where the tyres are. So I'm going to get the front tyre first. And I'm just going to roll that over the base like that. And then likewise on the other side, I'm just going to roll that across it like there. I'm then going to get the back wheel, and I'm going to move that up. It's actually, a lot of the green stuff's come off on there. Doesn't matter, I can take that off the tyre afterwards. But I just want to roll the tyre to get a bit of tread on there. So once I'm kind of happy with that tread, I can reposition the quad on the base. And I've got the tyre tread running through. Doesn't matter that it's not on every bit here. I don't mind, because I've got the base is going to have different texture and things like that on it. But for now I've got that texture on there. I've let the green stuff dry. I've then primed with a white primer the whole of the base. As you see, when we put the quad in place, we see those tyre tracks. There aren't as many coming out of the back because I'm going to put a bit more texture on there. And what I'm going to use for that in this video is some of the Citadel technical and texture paints. So whenever I'm doing basing, I tend to use a mixture of these to create a more randomized base effect, and then after they're dry I bring them together with a few other techniques. So what I'm going to do to start with, I'm going to use the Aguilan Earth and put it on a few places. This is the one that crackles as it dries. So I'm going to give it a good shake. And then I've got two things that I apply these with. I have the tool that you get with the sculpting kit, but I also use an old brush to kind of put it in places. So as I open this up, what I'm going to do is paint this with this brush around in various different places. So I'm going to put it on quite thick in places. The key thing is I don't want to go over where I've put the tyre tracks. And then I'm going to move on to one of the other paints. So this is the Mordant Earth. Now I've got two other ones here. I've got the Astrogranite and then a Stirland Mud. So now I've got this base covered in all of the technical and texture paints. I need to let it thoroughly dry. Okay, so I've let this dry. I did force it a little with a bit of heat so I could get some nice crackle spots appear quite quickly. So as you can see, we've got the crackle detail and a few rough bits of detail, but the tyre tracks are still clearly visible. What I want to do now is knock everything back with a single wash. And what I'm going to use is Agrax Earthshade. So I'm going to paint the whole thing with this, then let it dry, and then build it up with possibly a few more shades and inks, and then do a dry brush over the top to kind of tie it all together. Okay, so I've covered the whole of that in the Agrax Earthshade. So we're now going to let this dry before we move on to the next step. So the Agrax Earthshade has dried. It's a little bit shiny in places still, but it doesn't bother me because we're going to put a few more coats of other things on. What I've decided to do now is a dry brush over the whole thing to start tying those colours together before I then play around with another wash and then possibly another dry brush. So to start with, I'm going to dry brush with some grey cere. Okay, so after a bit of dry brushing, you can see the colours are kind of merging together under that dry brush coat. Some of the shades still coming through. What I want to do now is actually put another coat of shade or inks onto this before I do a final dry brush on top of it in certain places. So for this next shade, I'm going to use some Nuln Oil. And I'm not going to paint this over everything on this one. It's only going to be in a few spots. So I'm going to do where some of the cracks are, where the treads are. But I don't want to build it up too much so it becomes too dark. Okay, so now I've put some of the Nuln Oil onto this in certain places. I'm going to come back with the Agrax Earthshade. And again, I'm not going to put this everywhere. I'm just going to put it in a few places just to pick up any more little kind of details, any of the cracks, that kind of thing. Okay, so for now, that's the final shade going on there. So I need to let this dry thoroughly before I do the final dry brush on top just to bring it all together. So we'll let that dry and move on to the next step. So we now let that shade dry thoroughly. I'm going to do one final dry brush on this for now, just to knock back some of the darker colours slightly and just get it ready for when I paint the quad to go onto the base. So what I'm going to use for this final one for now is some Rakarth Flesh. So, not much dry brushing on that final coat, just tying that together. But I think it's turned out quite nicely, from those tyre tracks which I did in the green stuff to then all of that different texture and technical paint. We've got the cracking ground, we've got those different colours underneath. I mean, for now, if we put the unpainted quad on the base, you can see we've got that quite nice apocalyptic ash waste base.